Washington managing editor Catherine Falders and transportation reporter Sam Sweeney joining me now for more. So, Catherine, a judge says that Trump's attempt to suspend SNAP is unlawful. What more? He didn't mention anything about it there on the tarmac, but what more do we know?
Yeah, that is interesting. We're referring, and this is just in from, by the way, our colleague Peter Charalambos, who was reading through this ruling. This was a hearing that was heard yesterday on an emergency basis to try and get a judge to restore those funds that will be lost, Kira, as you say, at midnight. So this federal judge in Boston did rule that the administration's attempt to suspend the SNAP funding, as you mentioned, is unlawful, but that judge declined to issue an immediate order.
Okay, so a federal judge just hit pause on a major Trump trial, like completely froze everything. And the reason? An advisor's phone got cracked open, and apparently what's inside is absolutely wild. We're talking explosive evidence that has the entire political world losing its minds right now. This isn't some random delay. This is Judge James Boasberg saying, hold up, we need to stop everything because there's serious potential for evidence tampering. Yeah, evidence tampering. Which tells you right there that whatever's on this phone is big enough to shake up the entire case. And here's the kicker. AT&T got slapped with a gag order. They can't tell the advisor about the subpoena for at least a year. A whole year. That's not normal procedure, folks. That's the kind of move you see when prosecutors think someone might destroy evidence the second they find out it exists. So what's actually on this phone? Well, forensic experts finally cracked it open after months of legal battles. Months. This wasn't like, oh, we got into the phone yesterday. No. They've been fighting to access this thing for a long time. And now that it's open, we're seeing logs of social media activity, direct messages, and communications with other Trump associates during key events that are under investigation. The timing matters here. We're talking about messages and calls during moments that prosecutors have been circling for years. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Because you're the constitutionally elected lawyer for the people of your state, pushing back against illegal activity from a president. I can't think of a more chilling activity that this previous administration headed by Biden, and then of course his minions who were doing his dirty work were. That's again why, I think it's just easy to kind of like, oh, there's another, whatever, it's another story, and there's another, like, if you put this in its full context.
And the political fallout? Oh man, it's already started. Trump supporters are screaming about judicial overreach. They're calling this a weaponized legal system. Come on, you knew that was coming. Every time a judge makes a move that doesn't go Trump's way, it's automatically weaponization. It's automatically biased. But here's the thing. The judge didn't just wake up one day and decide to freeze the trial for fun. There's a legal threshold for this kind of emergency order. You need real justification. You need to show the court that proceeding without addressing new evidence would create serious problems for the integrity of the investigation. Now, critics on the other side are saying this proves Trump's inner circle was hiding something. They're saying if the evidence wasn't damaging, why would anyone fight so hard to keep investigators away from it? Why spend months in legal battles over a phone if there's nothing incriminating on it? Are you kidding me? The optics alone are terrible. And that's before we even know exactly what messages are in there. This all went down on October 29th, 2025. That's just days ago, which means we're in real time watching this unfold. The media is scrambling. Legal analysts are working overtime trying to explain what this means. And both sides of the political aisle are already spinning this to fit their narratives. The left says it's proof of wrongdoing. The right says it's proof of persecution. And honestly, depending on which news channel you watch, you'd think we're talking about two completely different stories. But let's zoom out for a second. Why does this matter beyond just Trump? Well, we're looking at fundamental questions about how our legal system handles politically sensitive cases. Can judges pause trials based on new evidence? Yes. Should there be limits on how long they can gag telecommunications companies? That's debatable. And what happens when the legal process becomes so entangled with political theater that regular people can't tell what's actually happening anymore? That's where we are right now. The timing is also brutal. Trump's in his second term. His administration is dealing with multiple ongoing investigations, and every new development, every court filing, every emergency order, it all feeds into the larger narrative about whether he's being held accountable or being targeted unfairly. Your answer to that question probably depends entirely on whether you voted for him or not. In this phone, this advisor's phone that just got unlocked, it might be the most important piece of evidence in this entire case. We're not talking about vague allegations anymore. We're talking about digital records, timestamps, message logs, the kind of hard evidence that's very difficult to explain away. So yeah, the judge froze the trial, and yeah, both sides are freaking out, and yeah, this is going to dominate headlines for weeks, because whatever comes next, whatever these messages actually say, is going to change the entire trajectory of this legal battle. The intensity of this moment can't be overstated. We've seen Trump face legal challenges before. We've seen investigations and indictments and courtroom drama, but this particular freeze, this emergency order based on newly discovered phone evidence, it feels different. It feels like we're approaching some kind of inflection point where the accumulated weight of all these legal battles is finally reaching critical mass. And you know what's wild? The fact that they had to crack the phone in the first place. Modern encryption is no joke. Law enforcement agencies have been complaining for years about how difficult it is to access encrypted devices, even with court orders. So the fact that federal investigators spent months working to get into this specific phone, that tells you they believed it was worth the time and resources. They weren't just fishing, they had reason to think this device contained something significant. And that's exactly why we need to break down what's really happening here. Not the spin, not the talking points, just the facts and what they actually mean for everyone involved. Because this story is only getting started. Alright, so let's dig into the details because there's a lot more going on here than just the judge hitting pause. The story starts with this advisor, a former Trump insider whose identity hasn't been fully disclosed in public documents yet. But what we do know is that this person was close enough to Trump during his presidency that their communications are considered critical evidence in whatever investigation is happening right now. And here's where it gets interesting. Investigators have been trying to access this phone for months. Like this has been a whole legal saga. The advisor's lawyers were fighting the subpoena. They were arguing about privacy rights and executive privilege and all these legal protections. Standard stuff when you're dealing with high-profile political cases. But the prosecution kept pushing. It kept going back to judges saying, look, we have reason to believe there's relevant evidence on this device and we need access to it. Eventually they won. The court sided with prosecutors and ordered the phone to be turned over. But even then, it wasn't simple. The device was encrypted. Modern smartphones are basically digital fortresses. You can't just plug them into a computer and download everything. So forensic experts had to crack it. And that takes time. Specialized software, technical expertise. We're talking about the kind of digital forensics that federal agencies use for serious criminal investigations. Once they finally got in, that's when everything changed. The logs showed frequent social media activity during periods that investigators care about. Direct messages between the advisor and other Trump associates. Possible communications during key events that are part of the investigation. And look, we don't have the full contents yet. The court documents are sealed, but prosecutors went to Judge Boasberg and said we need an emergency order because this changes everything. That's when the judge issued the freeze, October 29th, 2025. The order specifically cited serious jeopardy to the investigation and potential destruction or tampering with evidence. Think about that language, serious jeopardy. That's not something judges throw around casually. You use that phrase when you genuinely believe that moving forward without addressing new information could compromise the entire case. And then there's the AT&T gag order. This is huge. The judge barred AT&T from notifying the advisor about the subpoena for at least 1 year. 1 full year. Why would you do that? Well, because if the advisor finds out that investigators are pulling phone records and message logs, they might try to contact other people mentioned in those messages. They might try to coordinate stories. They might start deleting things or destroying other evidence. So you keep them in the dark. You don't let them know that the walls are closing in until you've already gathered everything you need. Now, Trump supporters are calling this insane. They're saying it's unconstitutional. How can you gag a phone company for a year? How can you keep someone from knowing their own communications are being investigated? And honestly, those are fair questions, There are real civil liberties concerns here, but prosecutors would argue that this is standard practice in ongoing investigations where there's flight risk or evidence destruction risk. You don't tip off suspects, you don't give them a chance to cover tracks, you build your case quietly, and then you bring charges. The political implications, though, oh man, this is happening during Trump's second term. He's already dealing with multiple legal battles. His administration has been under constant scrutiny since day one, and now we've got a frozen trial and explosive phone evidence. How does this play out in the court of public opinion? Well, it depends entirely on who you ask. For Trump critics, this is validation. They've been saying for years that Trump's inner circle was hiding evidence of wrongdoing. They've been saying that if you dig deep enough, if you crack open the right devices, you'll find proof of illegal activity or unethical behavior. And now, here we are. A judge has frozen a trial specifically because new evidence might be that damaging. So they're taking victory laps. They're saying, see, we told you, there was something there all along. For Trump supporters, this is persecution, pure and simple. They're arguing that prosecutors are so desperate to get Trump that they'll violate civil liberties. They'll gag phone companies. They'll freeze trials based on incomplete evidence. They're saying this is what a weaponized justice system looks like, when judges can issue emergency orders that target political opponents without full transparency. And you know what? They're not entirely wrong to be concerned about the precedent this sets. If you believe Trump is innocent, then yeah, this looks like overreach. But here's what both sides are missing. The legal system doesn't move this fast unless there's real substance. Judges don't freeze trials on a whim. Federal prosecutors don't spend months fighting for access to a phone unless they have good reason to believe it contains critical evidence. And courts don't issue year-long gag orders unless there's genuine concern about witness tampering or evidence destruction. So something real is happening here. This isn't just political theater. There are actual legal mechanisms in motion. The media coverage has been predictably divided. CNN and MSNBC are covering this as a major breakthrough in holding Trump accountable. Fox News and conservative outlets are covering it as judicial activism and prosecutorial misconduct. And regular people watching at home, they're probably more confused than ever because depending on your news source, you're getting completely different versions of the same story. What we know for certain is this: a federal judge froze a Trump-related trial. The freeze came after investigators unlocked an advisor's phone. That phone contains communications that prosecutors believe are significant enough to warrant pausing the entire proceeding. A&T has been ordered not to notify the advisor for at least a year, and both political sides are spinning this as hard as they possibly can. What we don't know yet is what the messages actually say. We don't know which Trump associates are mentioned in those communications. We don't know what specific events the messages relate to, and we don't know how long this freeze will last. Will it be days, weeks, months? That depends entirely on how quickly prosecutors can analyze the evidence and present it to the court in a way that either strengthens or fundamentally alters their case. The next steps are crucial. Prosecutors need to go through everything on that phone. They need to identify which communications are relevant. They need to potentially interview other people mentioned in the messages. And then they need to go back to Judge Boasberg and say, okay, here's what we found. Here's how it changes the case. And here's what we're asking the court to do next. That process takes time. But every day that trial stays frozen, the speculation grows, the political pressure builds, and the stakes get higher for everyone involved. The technical aspects of this investigation matter too. Digital forensics isn't like what you see on TV, where someone types for 30 seconds and magically unlocks everything. Real forensic analysis of a smartphone can take weeks or even months. You're pulling data from multiple apps. You're reconstructing deleted messages. You're analyzing metadata to establish timelines. You're verifying authenticity to make sure nothing's been tampered with. It's painstaking work that requires expertise and resources. And the fact that this phone belonged to someone in Trump's inner circle, that adds layers of complexity. Were any of the communications covered by attorney-client privilege? Were any protected by executive privilege claims? These are legal questions that need to be sorted out before evidence can be used in court. You can't just dump everything you find into the trial record. There are rules about what's admissible and what's not. Meanwhile, the political world keeps spinning. Republicans in Congress are already calling for hearings. They want to know who authorized the subpoena. They want to know what legal standard was used to justify the gag order. They want transparency about the entire process. Democrats are pushing back, saying that's exactly what you'd expect from people trying to protect Trump. They're saying, let the investigation play out before you start screaming about misconduct. So let's break this down into what actually matters. Not the spin, not the political noise, just the core facts and what they mean going forward. First, the legal mechanics. When a judge freezes a trial, based on new evidence is called a stay of proceedings. It's not common, but it's also not unheard of. Courts have the authority to pause cases when circumstances change in ways that could affect the fairness or outcome of the trial. In this case, Judge Boasberg determined that the evidence from the advisor's phone was significant enough that continuing without addressing it would be inappropriate, maybe even prejudicial. Think about it from the judge's perspective. You're in the middle of a trial. Evidence is being presented. Arguments are being made. And then suddenly prosecutors come to you and say, hey, we just unlocked the phone and there's a whole bunch of communications we didn't know about before. Communications that might corroborate our case or might introduce new elements we need to investigate. What do? You can't just ignore it. You can't pretend it doesn't exist. So you pause. You give everyone time to review the new material, and then you reconvene and figure out how it changes things. Second, the gag order on AT&T. This is where things get legally complicated. Prosecutors argued that notifying the advisor about the subpoena would create a substantial risk of evidence destruction or witness tampering. The judge agreed and issued what's called a non-disclosure order. These aren't forever. They have time limits. In this case, at least 1 year. But depending on how the investigation progresses, that could be extended or it could be lifted early. The constitutional questions here are real. Does someone have a right to know when their phone records are being subpoenaed? In normal circumstances, probably. But when there's an active investigation and credible concern about evidence tampering, courts have ruled that temporary gag orders are permissible. It's a balance between individual rights and the government's ability to investigate potential crimes. And yeah, that balance is always going to be controversial, especially in politically charged cases. Third, what this means for Trump. Look, this isn't good optics, no matter how you spin it. Having a trial frozen because of explosive phone evidence doesn't exactly scream innocence, but it also doesn't automatically mean guilt. We don't know what the messages say yet. We don't know if they're actually incriminating or if they're just embarrassing. There's a big difference between finding evidence of illegal activity and finding evidence that someone said something stupid in a private message. But here's what's undeniable. This adds to the mountain of legal issues Trump's dealing with. Every new development, every frozen trial, every emergency court order, it reinforces the narrative that there's something to investigate. And even if Trump is ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, the process itself is damaging. It keeps him in the headlines for negative reasons. It gives his critics ammunition, and it creates uncertainty about his administration's stability. Fourth, the political fallout. Republicans are furious. They're calling this prosecutorial overreach. They're demanding transparency about what's on the phone. They're questioning whether judges should have this much power to freeze trials and gag phone companies. Some GOP lawmakers are already talking about potential legislation to limit these kinds of orders in politically sensitive cases. Can you believe this? They want to change the rules because they don't like how the rules are being applied. Democrats, meanwhile, are saying this proves the justice system is working. They're arguing that no one is above the law, not even former presidents or their advisors. They're saying if there's evidence of wrongdoing, it should be investigated thoroughly, regardless of political consequences. And they're pushing back hard against claims that this is persecution, saying if Trump and his team have nothing to hide, they shouldn't be afraid of investigators accessing communications. The media's role in all this can't be ignored either. Every outlet is covering this story, but the framing is wildly different depending on political lean. Conservative media is emphasizing the gag order and the frozen trial as evidence of a rigged system. Liberal media is emphasizing the explosive evidence and the potential for accountability. And people consuming news from just one side are getting a completely distorted picture of what's actually happening. Fifth, what happens next? The trial stays frozen while prosecutors analyze the phone evidence. That could take weeks. They need to go through messages, identify relevant communications, potentially interview other people mentioned in those messages. Then they go back to court. They present their findings to Judge Boasberg, and the judge decides whether to resume the trial as planned or whether the new evidence requires changing course entirely. If the evidence is as significant as prosecutors suggest, we could see new charges filed, we could see additional subpoenas, we could see other Trump associates getting dragged into this, or if the evidence turns out to be less explosive than advertised, the trial could resume relatively quickly and Trump's team will claim vindication. But either way, this story isn't going away. It's going to dominate political coverage for the foreseeable future. Every court filing will be scrutinized, every legal analyst will weigh in, and both sides will continue fighting over the narrative because that's what politics has become. It's not about truth anymore. It's about who can control the story. The bigger picture here is about accountability and power. Can sitting presidents or their associates be held legally accountable for actions taken during their time in office? What limits should exist on prosecutorial power when investigating political figures? How do we balance the need for thorough investigations with concerns about political weaponization of the justice system? These aren't easy questions. In this case, with its frozen trial and explosive phone evidence, is forcing us to confront them in real time. There's also the question of precedent. What message does this send to future administrations? If Trump's advisors face aggressive prosecution for communications made during his time in office, does that create a chilling effect on political speech? Or does it simply establish that government officials need to follow the law like everyone else? Your answer probably depends on your political perspective. And let's talk about the impact on public trust. Half the country sees this as proof that justice still works. The other half sees it as proof that justice has been corrupted by partisan politics. There's almost no middle ground anymore. And that's dangerous, because when people lose faith in fundamental institutions like the courts, when they can't agree on basic facts about what's happening, that's when democracies start to fracture. The phone itself represents something larger. It's a symbol of how much of our lives are now digitized. Everything we say, everything we do, it leaves a trail, messages, logs, metadata. And in a legal context, all of that can become evidence. Privacy advocates have been warning about this for years. They've been saying that the more we rely on digital communication, the more vulnerable we become to surveillance and investigation. This case proves them right. But it also raises questions about how we investigate powerful people. If someone in a position of authority commits crimes, shouldn't we use every tool available to uncover the truth? Or should there be special protections for political figures that regular citizens don't get? Again, there's no easy answer. It depends on whether you value accountability over privacy or privacy over accountability. What we're witnessing right now is history being written in real time. Years from now, people will look back at this moment, this frozen trial, this cracked phone, and they'll see it as a turning point. Either a turning point toward greater accountability for the powerful, or a turning point toward the weaponization of justice for political ends. Which narrative wins out depends entirely on what comes next. So yeah, a judge froze a Trump trial, an advisor's phone got cracked open, the evidence inside might be game-changing, and the entire political world is watching to see what comes next. This is the kind of story that defines a presidency, that shapes how history remembers this era, and we're all living through it as it unfolds. The legal battles will continue, the political spin will intensify, and somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, there's actual truth waiting to be discovered. Whether we ever get to see that truth, whether it ever cuts through the noise, that remains to be seen. Stay tuned, because whatever drops next is going to be massive. This story has legs, and it's only getting started.